Hello, and welcome to This Moment in Democracy. I'm Judge Travis Francis, and this is a special episode with the Election Nerds. My co-host today is Oliver Quinn, former Assistant Dean at Rutgers University Law School, Newark, and Director of the school's acclaimed Minority Student Program. Dean Quinn also serves as Chairman of the Rutgers University Newark Advisory Board and is a trustee of the Center for Election Reform, creator of the Election Nerds. The Center for Election Reform is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to the study of election reform issues. This podcast was recorded on July 24, 2023. This is a two-part edition with Ryan Haygood, civil rights lawyer and president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Today, we'll speak with Ryan about his early days and his time with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, as we all commonly know it. Ryan, welcome.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, it's our pleasure. So before we start talking about your early history, and Dean Quinn, I'm going to ask you to cover the questioning as we relate to that. Tell us a little bit, Ryan, about the Institute and how long you've been there and what its mission is.
Sure, I really appreciate the question. So next year, we will celebrate our 25th anniversary. We were founded by Alan Lowenstein, who also founded the Lowenstein Law Firm. And his heart for the Institute, his vision for our work would be that we would be an organization that does deep community organizing and uses research and writing and policy advocacy to build systems that empower people of color in our cities. And our work is organized now around what we think of as three interconnected pillars that include economic justice, criminal justice reform, and democracy and justice. And our work is really powered by people. We think a lot about how we use our voices to help build those systems that connect people of color in Newark to all of the best of this state, the vast richness of the state, the vast measures to empower people. And that's really the heart of our work. We've got a terrific board, which has over time included some notable people, including Oliver Quinn, who helped to bring me to this organization. I look forward to talking more about our work in the modern era, its connection to our founding, and where I think we're headed into the future.
So with respect to the three pillars, clearly today's program falls very depthly, if you will, within the democracy and justice pillar, correct?
It does. I think a lot about how, as you know, Judge, the Supreme Court thought about voting as the right that's preservative of all other civil rights. And so our democracy work is really guided by our vision for thinking about how we build in New Jersey the most inclusive democracy in the country. And I look forward to talking a bit about how we've done that over the past couple of years and where we're thinking about going into the future with that democracy expansion principle in mind.
Dean Quinn?
Thank you, Travis. I did have the honor of serving on the board of the Institute for Social Justice, and I, in fact, chaired the search committee that recruited Ryan Haygood. So I am particularly pleased to have him as our guest today. Ryan, we want to ask you to talk a little bit about your journey because it's been a fascinating one. Tell us about why you became a lawyer, when you decided to become a lawyer, and a little bit about your background, because I think it's important that we humanize these positions that we expose our audience to.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. I love the question, particularly because I'm celebrating my 8th anniversary at the Institute that Oliver helped to recruit me to those years ago. So that has led me to sort of a period of reflection. I've been practicing law now for more than 20 years. And that is a story unto itself because I didn't grow up as a young person knowing any lawyers at all. I'm originally from Denver, Colorado. I was raised by my mom there. And in high school, I had the course was called The Black Experience. It was taught by our social studies teacher, Mr. Pettigen. And Oliver, used to show us these black and white videos called Eyes on the Prize, which chronicled, as you know, the civil rights movement. And it was in those videos that I learned about these incredibly heroic Americans whose names we mostly would not know, who literally put themselves in harm's way in front of powerful fire hoses, in front of dogs, literally in front of harm's way to help move our country closer to its high ideals and away from its low practices. And, this was a class taught in the early 1990s. It was taught, unfortunately, right after lunch. And this was the era, Oliver, when we didn't have the benefit of air conditioning. And so the teacher, to try to cool the room down, would dim the lights. And so for some students, what that became was sort of a nap hour. But for me, watching these videos, I was really transformed, and I was inspired by the way that these folks use their voices to move us to the places where we should be, closer to our high ideals. And in those videos, I learned about Thurgood Marshall and his work as a civil rights lawyer, how he went on to found the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And it was those videos, along with Mr. Pettigen's urging, that helped me think about how I might become a lawyer, though I didn't know any. And I will say, quite literally, but for his decision to get, close to me, or as Brian Stevenson says, to get proximate to me, I wouldn't be talking to you now as a lawyer who's been practicing for 20 years.
You worked at LDF, the Legal Defense Fund. That is the gold standard. And as a lawyer, you obviously had many routes you could take. What inspired you to pursue social justice as an area of law that you wanted to practice in, and what led you to LDF?
Yeah, so I love the question. So, those videos brought me to Thurgood Marshall. It brought me to learn about the Legal Defense Fund, and it inspired me to go to law school. So in my second year in law school, I applied for an internship with the Legal Defense Fund. And I'll say to you, I then was a kid from Denver. I was going to law school in Boulder at the University of Colorado School of Law. I applied, to your point, Oliver, to work at Thurgood's organization, which, is the gold standard then and now of national civil rights organizations. And I applied for an internship. It was a telephone interview. And honestly, I thank the Almighty, I had a very positive interview. On that call was Elise Boddy, who you all know is a longtime law professor at Rutgers Law School, who now teaches at Michigan Law School. She was an education attorney at LDF, and she came to LDF by way of a fellowship called the Freed Frank LDF Fellowship. And so I got the internship, and I spent the summer of 2000 interning at LDF. Ironically, I lived that summer in the Newark YMCA, which is just behind where my office is at 60 Park Place. That was my first introduction to Newark. So during that summer, I spent the days learning about the law and the way in which we apply the law or facts to the law to make the case about how we address structural racism. At nighttime, living in the Newark YMCA, I saw the impact of racism on populations. And it was in that summer that I began to see the way in which you use the facts and the law to empower people who had been separated from the very best things in our society. And it was that summer that led me to fall in love with Newark, having lived in the Y, working at LDF in Manhattan. That summer, Oliver, Elise Boddy said, I came to LDF by way of the Freed Frank LDF Fellowship. And for the students, it's really important to lift this up because the fellowship still exists. She said, you should apply for it. And so the fellowship is a 4-year relationship between a law firm called Freed Frank and the NAACP Legal Defense Funds. You spend 2 years at the law firm learning how to become a lawyer, about the architecture of litigation, getting skills to litigate and to think about how to become an attorney. And you spend the next 2 years at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I applied for that fellowship. There's just one fellow per year. Elise Body, as it turns out, was on the search committee, and I prepared doggedly for that interview for the fellowship. And thankfully, I received it. And the following year, I graduated from law school, 2001. And I came to New York City, worked at the firm for 2 years. And then I spent the next 12 years at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund litigating national civil rights cases, mostly in federal courts at all levels and in state court too. And it was, to your point, Oliver, the experience of a lifetime, shaped a lot of how I see the world, how I see the law. And I don't take for granted what that experience has meant to me, how rare it is to have had it, and how thankful I am for that time there.
Let me just pose one question to you with respect to your earlier references to eyes on the prize. You had the opportunity to actually walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 2015 with President Obama, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the original march. Can you tell us a little bit how, first of all, how you got there with Obama, and then some of your feelings as you walked across that bridge?
If you asked me, 20 years ago when I was, more than 20 years ago when I was finishing law school, Ryan, if you could draw it up anyway, what would the next 20 years look like? I promise you, I would have undersold it by 1,000. Like these last 20 plus years practicing have led me to places to see things I couldn't have imagined. That was one. So when I finished my time at Freed Frank, the way the fellowship works, and again, for the students on the line who are interested in law school, one, I would love to talk to you about it, about the experience. Two, I encourage you to do some research on the Freed Frank LDF Fellowship. The way the fellowship works is when it's your time to go to LDF, you go to whichever group needs support. And their work is organized similar to ours at the Institute, but they also have an education practice. And when it was my turn to go to LDF, there was a need in voting. And the truth is, I really wanted to do education. I hadn't thought a whole lot about voting. Obviously, I would go on to build a deep love for it. But initially, if I had my druthers, I would have chosen education. I was staff, though, in the voting group. And some of the early work of my time in the voting group was building the record to support the reauthorization of a federal voting rights bill called the Voting Rights Act. It was up for reauthorization in 2005 and 2006. And so we were working with people like the late Congressman John Lewis and other legislators to build the record for Congress to be able to make the case for why we continue to need the protections of the Voting Rights Act, and this protection in particular called Section 5. And as you know, and many of the listeners know, Section 5 was a provision that applied primarily to the southern states, but also to a few states in the north and in the west with long histories of discrimination in voting. And it required those jurisdictions, whenever they wanted to make a voting change, whether it was to the date of an election, if they wanted to move an election, the qualifications for running or for voting, they had to ask for pre-clearance or for approval from the federal government before they did so, on the theory that in the past, when they had made voting changes on their own, they had been discriminatory. So Section 5 was really kind of a prophylactic, a protective mechanism for voting. And so in 2005 and 6, we were building the congressional record in support of its further constitutionality. And we built a record that was really unlike any other record for a congressional act. It was more than 15,000 pages, chronicling more than 1,000 instances where the Voting Rights Act had protected real people from real discrimination in real places. But because it was such a powerful measure, it was challenged by a state each time it was reauthorized. So this is before we have in office a Black president. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act more broadly, initially passed in 1965, was really a watershed moment in our democracy, and it led within one generation to the election of a first Black president. But as you know, after the first Black president gets elected, then comes a narrative that we no longer need the protections of the Voting Rights Act.
We're in a post-racial society.
And remember, that was a terminology when Barack Obama was elected to the highest office in the land. There were many who said the fact of his election has ushered us into a post-racial society. But in fact, what we saw was this incredible backlash that we're still seeing today, frankly, that led to the 2016 election, in my estimation. And so what we saw was that President Obama gets elected. There are folks who then say we no longer need protections, including Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And to make a long story short, it's challenged by a county in Alabama, which gave birth to the Voting Rights Act, Shelby County, Alabama. And unfortunately, that challenge was successful. And the Supreme Court did 10 years ago this year, 2013, tore out the heart of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5. But to your question, Judge, for the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, I was fortunate enough to be in Alabama. We had gone to Alabama each year to Selma to hold a voting rights workshop. In this particular year, the 50th anniversary, President Obama was there. And there was this moment, Judge, where I was on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Folks know that Edmund Pettus was a grand wizard of the Alabama KKK. The bridge still bears his name. So we're doing a reenacted march of the original march over the bridge. I'm on the bridge named after the grand wizard of the KKK with the first Black president of the United States in a march led by the late Congressman John Lewis. And as we get to the top of the bridge, the congressman pauses and offers a prayer like he did 50 years earlier on the original day of the march, which is also called Bloody Sunday. And as a kid who saw this, the fight for this act in the Eyes on the Prize videos as a high school kid, it was really a moment where I felt like I was outside of myself. But you know what it also taught me? It also taught me about the power of advocacy, right? There's no reenactment of that march 50 years later. If there weren't 50 years earlier, 600 heroic people who organized themselves to fight for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. In an interview, the late Congressman Lewis was asked, Congressman Lewis, what was, when you were marching in the original march 50 years earlier, what was on the other side of the bridge? What were you thinking about? And he said, on the other side of the bridge was our power, it was our vote, and he said it was Barack Obama. And in many ways, I think where we are in the country now, we're still fighting that ongoing march for freedom and democracy. We still, to be sure, have many other bridges to cross. And part of what inspires this work is the reality that people are doing that in this moment here in New Jersey and certainly across this country.
Oliver, I know you have a couple other questions, but it's interesting because not many people get the opportunity to participate in a struggle that they have admired during the early days of their life. You're obviously a young man. You're certainly younger than I am, and certainly younger than Oliver. I'm presuming you're younger than Oliver.
Listen, just a couple of years, Judge. Just a couple of years.
Okay. But have you had the opportunity also to meet any of those legal icons? I mean, you might be a little young for Thurgood Marshall, but maybe some of the other icons in the civil rights legal arena in that space?
What's crazy to me, in my mind, though I am an older man at 46, Judge, not quite at the level of you and Oliver. But, what's crazy to me is, I didn't ever get a chance to meet Justice Thurgood Marshall. And, it's odd to have thought so much about a person that I didn't ever have a chance to meet. I did meet his wife a bunch of times. His wife was on the board of LDF. But the LDF experience brought me into rooms with presidents, with members of Congress, with elite lawyers at the Supreme Court, with Constance Baker Motley, who was one of Thurgood Marshall's mentees and who worked with him at LDF and then later served on the Federal Court of Appeals. So, federal judges, Supreme Court judges, and I will say more immediately, my peer group is made up of folks who do this work with their lives. One of my best friends is Christina Swarns. She and I were at LDF together. She now leads the Innocence Project. She became one of the very few Black women who argued in the Supreme Court and won in a death penalty case. Another good friend of mine is Kristen Clark, who now leads the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, the first Black woman to do that. Another of my friends, Damon Hewitt, leads the Lawyers Committee. And that just the people in my friend group, are doing this work, building on a legacy, a foundation that we didn't build. And I even to your point about the marching over the bridge with President Obama, I was in Selma, Alabama earlier this year in March, and I walked over the bridge with President Biden. And so, just if you look in the photo, there's the president, then there's Damon and I, then there's Kristen, then there is Martin Luther King Jr.'s son, and they're members of Congress. And it's just, to be in the same space with these folks who have done incredible work at the highest levels of the kind that really fuels my passion it's an additional reward. That's not why we do this work, right? But to be in these rooms with these folks who've given their lives to this work to make this country so much better is really humbling for me. And then here in Jersey, we do a lot of work with, Senator Cory Booker and our other members of Congress. And because our work is policy work, we work a lot with the governor of New Jersey and the attorney general and members of the legislature. So I think I just would say yes to your question for sure.
So 8 years ago, Ryan, you made a decision to leave LDF and come to the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, which we are eternally grateful for. What was it that prompted you to consider not just the change of employer, but really changing from being a litigator to being the head of a broad-based advocacy organization like the Institute?
So, initially, when I learned about the opportunity, one of the people who reached out to me, this name is going to sound familiar because I've said it now at least twice. Elise Body was at this point teaching at Rutgers, and she was also on the board of the Institute. So she was one of the people who reached out and told me about the opportunity and encouraged me to consider it. My initial reaction, candidly, Oliver, was one of deep insecurity. I had been litigating for a good while and had become comfortable supervising attorneys, but I hadn't led an organization, as you well know, Oliver, one of my early coaches in this role. And so it was kind of a scope shift for me in the way both in the work I focus on, but also how I thought about myself as a lawyer, as an advocate. And so, I thought a lot about how to confront my insecurity around the opportunity, but it also coincided with, where I was in my work professionally. I was just finishing up a trial in the Texas photo ID case. Really quickly, the 2010 census showed that Texas's population had grown by 4 million people, mostly fueled by Black and brown growth. And the Texas legislature, frankly, as a way to stop new voters of color from participating, passed, at that time, one of the nation's strictest photo ID measures, which would not allow for the use, for example, of student IDs as it did before, but would allow for the use of things like concealed handgun licenses. And this was clearly a law designed to stop potential new voters of color from coming into the Democratic fold in Texas. And so this is 2015 when this case is in trial. I am working on it with a team of amazing lawyers, but I began to really think about how the new fight to beat these kinds of measures back, yes, there needed to be a national push, but there also needed to be really intense advocacy coming from the ground up in states. And it was in that trial that I began to think about the limitations of national level litigation, national level advocacy. Yes, you need that to be sure, but you also need a complementary effort that comes from the ground up in our states, as we saw, for example, in Selma. And so I learned about this opportunity, and it was really in the second interview, Oliver, where you were grilling me with those very difficult questions, that I began to really develop, a vision for what I might be able to do as the head of an organization, even as I felt deeply insecure about the prospect of doing that, including, as you and I discussed a bunch of times, around fundraising, around managing, around HR, around what it means to lead an organization when people rely on you for their paycheck, for example, or for a vision about where we're going and how to organize ourselves around it. But I will say to you, these last years have been, this has been an opportunity of a lifetime. And there's not been a day, I mean this with all sincerity, and this is not hyperbolic, but every day I've come to the Institute, I've loved the day. There's not been a day where I've woken up and thought to myself, oh gosh, I got to go to work. It is for me a privilege to do this work. And I've grown to love the opportunity to lead this organization, including around keeping, being very sober-minded about the things I didn't have when I came here, the skill sets I didn't have, those that I did have that I have to sharpen, and those that I have to build or secure. And so I think, having you, Oliver, and other very, people generous with their time have helped to develop me into the leader that I have ultimately become here at this organization.
Ryan, your story is riveting. And in part 2, we're going to go deeper into some of the cases that you litigated, and particularly your views with respect to those cases as they relate not only to the Voting Rights Act, but to the issue of reform in voting and where you see the future with respect to reform in voting. So I want to thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll discuss Ryan Haygood's specific cases that he litigated involving the Voting Rights Act. Today's podcast has been brought to you by the Eagleton Institute of Politics and the Center for Election Reform. Eagleton is a nonpartisan research unit of Rutgers University, New Brunswick. This moment in democracy was made possible in part by the generosity of Gerald and Kiko Harvey and Eagleton's many supporters. To support Eagleton's work or sign up for its newsletter, click the links in the description. To learn more about the Institute, visit eagleton.rutgers.edu and follow Eagleton on social media. Please visit the Center for Election Reform at www.centerforelectionreform.com to learn more about the Election Nerds and other podcasts. Thank you for listening.